Did you know that some places have to pay to sing happy birthday? No, really. It's why in some restaurants and some places you might go to eat, they have a special birthday song rather than a regular birthday song. The reason is happy birthday is protected by copyright. No, really, there's a whole video in the link below that talks about this concept. This lecture is not going to deal with whether or not you can sing happy birthday or the ethics of copyright, but this is going to help you navigate some issues related to copyright, fair use, and attribution in a digital age. This lecture will not only serve you in this course in producing content, but it will also serve you in your professional life as well. We're going to cover three major topics. First, what is copyright? Second, we're going to cover Creative Commons licensing to some degree. And finally, we're going to cover some things about fair use in general. I'm going to give you a very basic definition as we move forward, so that way you have some very, very basic grasp if all you need to do is just get through this class. If you want to keep your blinders on, well, you can listen to me. But if you want to learn more about copyright and why it's important, I strongly recommend you take a look at the links below. Now, a basic idea of copyright is thinking about it like property rights. In other words, if you have a house, you have certain rights to that house. So you can say who can go on to it, how it can be used, those kinds of things. Now, copyrights act in a similar way with your intellectual property. In other words, it says who can use it, who can change it, and also who can make copies of it, and how they can profit from those copies. That's a very, very, very basic description of what copyright law is. It seems pretty simple at first, but we have to understand that copyright is a very complex concept and very important in the study of law. For those of you who are considering any kind of business work at all, ever, you need to understand copyright law and promotion. And the rest of this lecture will help you with two different tools to help you understand how copyright law functions and how to protect yourself and how to make a good, better world in digital spaces and to generally be a good citizen. Now, copyright is about the ability to use something legally. In other words, we think of a concept of intellectual property. Just in the same way that someone's house might be their property, someone's ideas can also be property, and they can be owned. And in the same way that someone has property rights to protect their space, their land, and those kinds of things, there's also a way for people to protect their intellectual property from it being stolen or misused or any other kind of abuse that may occur. We try to protect intellectual property in large part because intellectual property is not only profitable, but in many ways intellectual property can represent someone's individual vision, what they want to say about the world. And we want to try to protect those visions. We don't want certain things to be corrupted or changed, especially when the author didn't intend to do so. So we try to protect some of these rights with copyright, though copyright's not an entirely bad thing. Because copyright law is so complicated, and people in the digital age are sometimes anonymous or difficult to contact, there needed to be a system to help people who wanted to become content creators, such as yourselves, to understand how a work could be used and what was okay. So some artists created a thing called a blanket permission called Creative Commons. In other words, it's an idea that says you get a basic little license that's put on some of your photographs, your websites, or your other work. And what this does is this tells anyone who wants to take your work for another purpose how the work can be used according to this. Now, Creative Commons is not separate from copyright law. Copyright law still applies. But Creative Commons is just a good guide to help content creators and make creating things a little easier. And it helps set some basic parameters. Now, we're going to walk through the examples with 4 basic things you must consider with a Creative Commons license. And as we walk through these examples, we're going to assume that you are the original content creator. In other words, you made the original photograph or television show, song, whatever it is. You hold the copyright. Okay? And I want to use your work. So as you put your stuff onto the internet and you go for a Creative Commons license, there are 3 questions you have to consider, but one right you always have no matter what. So there are 4 things. These 4 things are commercial use, derivative works, and share alike. These are questions you have to answer, but the thing you always get is the 4th thing, attribution. All Creative Commons licenses require attribution. In other words, you have to say who the original content creator is. So if I want to use your work, I have to make sure that you get credit for it. I have to put your name there. I have to try to put your website there. If it's a publication, I have to try to put it in a publication. Now, it doesn't mean I have to put in a full APA or MLA citation, but I should try to give you credit as much as possible. The purpose of giving credit is that many people will put things on the internet not expecting any kind of financial rewards or financial gain. However, people want their work seen. People who are artists, musicians, painters, dancers, filmmakers, whatever, some people do this for hobbies or do this for the love of something. So they say, I want more people to see my work. Giving them credit allows other people who come to your website or your content creation, or in this case, my website or any content that I've made, to understand where they could find your work. So when I give you credit, people can come find more of your work. Now, that can have financial benefits as well, but we want to think about this as a different kind of currency. Attribution is credit, and credit is a kind of currency. So, since we're all sure that you will get attribution rights, in other words, if I take your content and don't give you credit, then I am violating the Creative Commons license, and I am violating the copyright as well. And this is a good reason to say that if you came after me, I should understand that there's a good reason why. Now, there are 3 questions you as the license holder want to consider before you get a Creative Commons license. The first thing is commercial use. Let's say I am trying to promote my business and I want to use your work. Now, you can decide when you put your work online whether or not you want your work to be used for commercial purposes, for a for-profit enterprise. You can say, I'd like it to be used for a for-profit enterprise, or at least you don't care. Or you can say, no, I only want my work to go to students, teachers, government organizations, universities, schools, people who are not planning to make any money off of using your work. That is entirely up to you as the content creator. This is part of your copyright, that you get to decide how something is used. The second major thing to consider after you've considered commercial use are what are called derivatives. In other words, do you want people to be able to change or modify, reshape your work into something else? There are some works that maybe you want to keep intact, entirely whole. And then there are times where maybe you want works to be chopped up a little bit more. Now, this is where copyright law and fair use law will start to conflict a little bit. So don't assume that if you say to me you don't want any derivatives, that automatically protects you in copyright law. But this is a good way to think about the ethics of use. In other words, if you're welcoming that people can cut up your work, change your work, modify your work, there might be new and more interesting works that come out as a result. But if you feel like your work must remain intact as it is, then you can say with part of your Creative Commons license that people cannot chop up your work. And the last thing to consider is what's called share alike. In other words, it's connected to the first question that if someone, or the second question, that if someone takes your work, if I take your work and I chop it up and I modify it to make some new work, can someone take my work and chop it up? So share alike is basically a requirement for me. So in other words, if I take your work and I make a derivative, then I have to allow other people to take that work, which came from your work, and make a derivative as well. The idea of encouraging a share alike license is to say that yes, if I'm allowed to make a derivative of your work, I should make sure that I pass on your work to others, because that means people might be connected to your original work. So the idea of a share alike license and share alike permission is to say that if I'm able to chop up your work, I want to make sure that others have the same privileges that I have. The purpose of Creative Commons is to simplify copyright law, but in some cases we might find that copyright law is a little bit more complicated, or something doesn't have a Creative Commons license. Things that don't have a Creative Commons license are maybe older works, books, television shows, all kinds of things that maybe you don't find in digital spaces. But sometimes people don't go through the process of making a Creative Commons license. Creative Commons is a nonprofit, but not everyone knows about it. So maybe you encounter some work and you're not sure whether or not you can use it. Now, this is a good time to talk about what's called fair use. In other words, these are reasons when you can change copyright law and you can say that your use is legitimate, legal, and should be allowed. Now, since you are in an educational institution, and if you're producing work for your classes as part of a nonprofit public institution, you're generally protected by fair use. So if you happen to be on your YouTube account and you get a little copyright strike where it says there's copyrighted material, you're generally okay by saying that you're under a fair use exemption. However, when you leave the university and you go somewhere else, you may not have those same protections. So when it comes to fair use, there are 4 things to consider. Now remember, when it comes to fair use, and we'll go over this more in class as well, fair use is not ironclad. In other words, there's not a perfect way to define what is fair use and what is not fair use. So we need to consider 4 separate issues when determining fair use. The first and most important is what's called the purpose or character of your institution. In other words, if you're a nonprofit institution, or if you're trying to do criticism of a work, or if you're teaching or doing scholarship, you tend to have things that lean toward fair use. However, commercial use tends not to go towards fair use. In other words, if you are a commercial entity, it is unlikely that the purpose leans toward fair use. The second, after purpose and character of your use, is what's called the nature of the work itself. Now, the nature of the work itself helps to understand that what kind of work is it and how is it produced. Things that are heavily statistical, scientific, technical tend to favor fair use. And also, things that are creative, things that are artistic, that tends to go against fair use. This is often a place where students tend to say, well, I want to use this play, I want to use this novel, I want to use this music, and this is often something that tends not to lean toward fair use. That doesn't mean you can't use it, but you have to look at all of the issues before determining if something might be fair use. The third thing after we go through purpose and nature is the amount of a work. Now, if you have a really, really small portion of a work and you're using just a little teeny bit of it, that tends to favor fair use. So for example, if you took a 60-second clip from a 2-hour film, that probably favors fair use. If you use a large portion of a work, then that doesn't favor fair use. Now, another thing to consider is not just the length of the use, but if what you're using is central to the heart of the work. If it's the major twist ending in something, then perhaps that gets to the heart of the work, the point of the work, and that goes against fair use. The last thing to consider is the effect on the marketplace. This is one of the things that's the hardest to quantify, but it can be the thing that we often think about the most. So is your use substituting for another way for someone to obtain this work? So for example, if you're talking about something in a speech and you're showing a piece of artwork, that's not a substitute for the artwork itself. But if you happen to be showing the artwork on YouTube and it prevents people from going to see the artwork in person, or it might be a substitute, then you could start to say that's where you're starting to lean into a bad category. The most obvious extreme would be if you took an entire movie and put it on YouTube, especially an entire movie where there is a legitimate avenue to buy and license it. The more there are legitimate avenues, the more that your use of it would have an effect on the marketplace. So fair use is always about purpose, nature, amount, and effect. Now, there are weird exceptions that when you leave the marketplace, you'll find a lot of stuff, and a lot of questions that I get about it have to do with what's called parody. Now, parody is protected speech. In other words, it's something that is protected under the First Amendment, and it's protected under, and copyright cannot touch something that is your First Amendment right. However, parody can pass some of the conditions except for effect. Because if someone is unable to distinguish between the parody and the real thing, that's where people who are objecting to a parody may have a point. Now, there's a fifth category that Stanford tends to say is worth considering, which is a sort of moral category. That the moral category tends to say that if you are a good entity, you're more likely going to get away with fair use or unfair use. But if you are a bad entity, you need to be much more careful about your use. Now, I am not going to stand here and say that some things are good and some things are bad, but a good thing to really consider, something if you want to be careful, is that in many worldviews, a for-profit use tends to lean more toward the bad, but not always. So, as you enter an organization, don't assume that you're going to be okay because you like your organization. Remember that any fair use trial or any fair use concerns or any copyright infringement is not going to be decided by a computer, it's going to be decided by people. But since you now understand a little bit about fair use, a little bit about Creative Commons, and a little bit about copyright law, you should be prepared to make good stuff.